Welcome everyone to our third session of this series. This is our third year and our third session on conversations on race and policing. I'm Mary Texera, and I would like to pass it over to Cecilia Smith, who is a student here on campus, and she's going to do the land acknowledgement.
Hi, welcome everyone. The CSUSBA land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. No, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Cecilia. We have a feature every week. It's sort of spotty though, because we don't always have good news, but we call it good news. And this week, and this is very subjective, this week the best news has been the exoneration of a young man by the name of Adnan Syed, a young Muslim American man from Baltimore, Maryland, who was arrested at age 17 for the murder of his ex-girlfriend. And I found out about Adnan's case through a podcast, as a matter of fact, through the podcast called Serial, S-E-R-I-A-L. And I would highly recommend that you take a look at it or listen to it, because it really lays out his case very, very well. And it was really obvious that there was police misconduct, there was prosecutorial misconduct. And he has been fighting this for 20 some years. He's in prison, was found guilty in prison, and he was released yesterday. And he went home, and the first thing he was looking for was leftovers in the refrigerator, which, you know, in 20 some years, you can't do that if you're in prison. So I am elated that I have been following his case for probably 5 years now, elated that he has finally been released, and hopefully they'll have, and I think Baltimore prosecutor's office, the DA's office has some leads to who the real murderer was. So with that, yay, good news, you know, and we hang on to that because we don't have many times very good news when it comes to criminal justice in the United States. You know, like more people dying on Rikers Island, which we've covered on this in this program, and more young men and women getting killed by the police. So it's always good to have good news. And with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. Zachary Powell, who is he is one of our own. He is from our criminal justice system here in San Bernardino. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Dallas. His research and teaching interests include policing, public policy, the social response to crime, and applied quantitative analysis. He has authored and co-authored numerous articles and books, and we will share his faculty profile in the chat, where you can find more about his teaching and research. And today, Zachary's going to talk about police reform and federal consent decrees. So if you always wanted to know what a consent decree was, by all means, listen up. And with that, I'll pass it over to Zachary. Thank you for being with us, Zachary.
Of course, hey, and thank you for having me. Right, it's been a little while since I've given a presentation like this, so it's nice to loosen up and get a degrease a little bit. So thank you again for having me. But yeah, so I guess we'll start with like a broader discussion of something else that's unrelated to police reform and consent decrees, right? And that's really a discussion of power. So, a lot of us are familiar with the concept of power, right? And there's an old adage that, power corrupts people. And because you have the utility, or you have the means to make someone's life more difficult, you can have your say in a lot of different kinds of ways, right? And so when you have that kind of power, right, you're addicted to it, right? And you can, and you're less inclined to listen to other people who may protest your use of power. At the same time, there's also an adage that's discussed by Robert Caro's book series, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, where he unveils Lyndon Johnson's use of presidential power, what drove him and what motivated him. And Robert Caro's approach to discussion of power is that, while there may be times and instances where power corrupts, it also reveals, and it tells you what you are willing to do with that power, what things matter most to you, and what does this say about you as an individual. So to kind of start, before I actually start the presentation part, I'd like to get into a discussion of what power has been revealed recently in terms of presidencies. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment here. So get this over here, and we're going to look at some news articles, right? Because I'm one of those people that still reads a newspaper. I actually read 3 newspapers every day. One of them is the Washington Post. Mary is one of them as well. So as we see in this particular instance, like we see Jeff Sessions, right, who was one of the attorneys general for the Trump administration. And right before he left, Jeff Sessions had a parting shot, if you will. And he set in a whole host of new restrictions on police reform instituted by the Department of Justice. So effectively what that Jeff Sessions did was to say that there was going to be some new rules, new standards that was going to make it harder for the Department of Justice to institute federal police reform. So there was a lot more restrictions related to that. Part of the justification for this policy change by the Trump administration was that police reform often has the ability for police departments and officers to internalize a lot of negative emotions, right? There's a lot of negative scrutiny. And if we think about, our recent history of any kind of police misabuse of power, there is a lot of negative scrutiny. There's a lot of protests, a lot of angry emotions. And so by curtailing the use of police reform agreements, right, the Trump administration is basically saying the police departments and the police officers, their feelings matter more than any kind of public outcry for police reform, right? Part of the justification for this from the Trump administration is that because officers would internalize negative emotions, they would be less likely to be proactive in their job duties. And as a result of that, crime would increase, right? So there's a big fear of violent crime. And that's consistent with a lot of the messaging that's being sent by the Trump administration as he may or may not run in 2024. Now, it is interesting, right? Because if we view the justification for this policy change, right, it is couched in the belief that the repercussions of doing something right is going to lead to more violence and is actually going to be more harmful. And I mentioned the LBJ series by Robert Caro earlier, and I read it recently. And so an interesting parallel that I see is that LBJ was responsible for passing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965 because of his legislative power. But before he was able to do that, a lot of Southern senators were against it. And one of the big cautionary tales from Richard Russell was that if there was civil rights, if there was increased voting access in the South especially, that there would be such a huge outpouring of white supremacist violence that we shouldn't do, a reform kind of effort. And so that's an interesting parallel that I see, between these two events. Now, having said that, we do know that Joe Biden was the lawfully elected president in the last election and is currently president. And if we look at Merrick Garland, right, who's the new attorney general, right, the first thing that he did in April, this is shortly after he was confirmed as attorney general, was to roll back the Trump era's restrictions on forcing local police reforms. And so there is a demonstrated tone shift between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in that even if we assume the risk of police officers disengaging from their duties is real, the Biden administration is committed to police reform and is willing to use the Department of Justice's power in order to do so. So today, what we'll end up discussing, right, is we've introduced that there are these foils of one another. Power is used by the Department of Justice to institute police reform, and so my talk today goes into pieces about what exactly that tool is, how it works, and what are some issues that are facing it, and what is maybe some hopeful stuff to look at. So to get that right, I was preparing my PowerPoint today, and then I was reminded of my good friend Dr. Alexis Norris here in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, who had a PowerPoint disruption sort of like mine today, right? So wherever you are, Alexis, I'm thinking of you today. So let me see, get this popped up, and then I'll share my screen again. Where is Adobe? There we go. Yes. Oh, it paused. I thought I paused for a second, right? So go ahead and view this in full screen mode. All right. So with this in here, so here today to talk about police reform and the federal consent decree process. So one of the there are many issues that are related to police misconduct in the United States, and some of the most visible and common ones that we see and are aware of, right, are obviously unconstitutional use of force, right? Especially if we look at lethal use of force, if we look at weapon use of force, right? We also see that there are issues related to illegal searches and seizures, and this relates to who is stopped in police duties, how often they're stopped, whether there was sufficient legal ground in order to stop someone or to search them once they were stopped, and of course related to issues of discrimination, right? Importantly, we should note that when we speak of police discrimination, right, there are a few things that we should consider. There are race and ethnicity issues about police targeting people of certain ethnic groups for unconstitutional use of force, also illegal searches and seizures. But there are also issues related to what police are not doing for people, right? So there are actions that police can take that demonstrably harm people, and there are also actions that the police cannot do and that is also a form of discrimination. As an example to think about, several years ago, the New Orleans Police Department was investigated by the Department of Justice. And one of the things that the New Orleans Police Department was unwilling to do was to investigate any kind of hate crime violence against the transgender community. They demonstrated a deliberate indifference to investigating hate crimes against members of the LGBTQI community, right? In other instances, right, there can also be religious discrimination. And that was an example that was in Arizona, where the police were used in a small town that was heavily Mormon populated, but the police would be used to target people who were non-Mormon. So, when we think, I think something that we should be mindful of, right, is that when we think, again, about police reform issues and misconduct, right, it is as much as about what police are doing to people as also what they're not doing to serve their community. So, when we think about these instances of police misconduct, right, one of the things that we often hear about, right, is that it is the actions of a single bad actor, right? This particular officer took actions that, deliberately harmed someone's life. And that's a problem, right? And in some cases, that is absolutely true, right? There are cases where it is an actions of a single officer that are completely unacceptable in any kind of democratic society. And, historically, you would be able to, seek some relief from this because you could have that officer arrested. You could file a complaint against an officer. You could also seek civil litigation, right? So these are all, pretty useful for seeking some kind of relief, right? Because you can target an individual officer who wronged a citizen and, have something happen to them, right? You can have some form of justice related to that. But the problem is that what about the instances, right, where the actions are well beyond an officer, right? When it is an organization that someone works for and not necessarily a police officer. And this is especially true because certain police departments have a long history of repeated patterns of police misconduct, right? Something that, has gone on for years and years and years. Historically, some police departments that may come to mind are the Los Angeles Police Department, which historically for many years had a poor reputation and a poor relationship with its police community, especially with issues to race and ethnic discrimination. There are also cases like in Philadelphia or in Washington, D.C., where there's a long history of many officers within a police department breaking up. And when we think about police reform, right, we're not necessarily looking to correct the behavior of a single individual officer, but we are looking to correct police organizations as a whole, because if there is a repeated pattern of police officers who continue to exhibit problematic behaviors, we should focus on reforming the police department itself then. So, so part of the Department of Justice's goal then is setting about correcting agencies with a long history of police misconduct. So in order to address this and fill this gap, the federal government did not have an oversight program in place up until 1994. There was no litigation that enabled the Department of Justice, or legislation that enabled the Department of Justice to oversee or correct any kind of longstanding police misbehavior. A lot of the remedies that were sought were either through civil litigation or filing a complaint. And those were seen as less than effective for instituting permanent organizational change in eliminating officer misconduct, or at least reducing it. So in 1994, in the wake of the Rodney King riots, the Congress decided to include a provision in the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act that allowed the Department of Justice to investigate and intervene into any police department that exhibited a pattern or practice of misconduct. So, this is a very powerful tool because it allows the Department of Justice, if they, suspect a police department may have certain behaviors, if they may, have a history of a bad relationship, that if there's a history or suspicion of illegal misconduct, the Department of Justice can now investigate that police department and then also force them to comply, to make revisions to their policy and their organization in order to reduce the misconduct. So the biggest issue, though, right, is that if we know that we have this power, if we know we can target problematic police departments, right, we first have to find them. And this is seemingly easy, right? We just got to find all these bad police departments. We know about them. We hear about them in the police department, and it's often more difficult than it looks. There's no really database of misconduct in America, right? That is, that was thought to be changed in the last year with the George Floyd Act that was passed by the House, but that did not clear the Senate. And so there really isn't a standardized collection system of any kind of misconduct, right? So the Department of Justice, without access to that kind of information or any kind of indicators, is forced to rely on alternative means to do that. More often than not, they tend to rely on official complaints. So if people reach out to the Department of Justice and say, hey, I suspect that this particular agency has a history of discrimination, I think this is something that the Department of Justice should investigate and intervene into. Sometimes The advocacy groups such as the ACLU will contact the Department of Justice and ask them to look into a police department. This is actually true for the first targeted agency, the Pittsburgh Police Bureau. The ACLU had filed a lawsuit against the Pittsburgh Police Bureau and then requested the Department of Justice to be to let Pittsburgh be the first agency investigated under Section 14141. Sometimes, though, there are instances where a police department requests the investigation because a new police chief comes in and they are asking for someone to take a further look, a deeper dive into their behavior. One example of this was when Chief Charles Ramsey took over of the Washington, D.C. Police Department. He was previously head of the Philadelphia Police Department and then took over in Washington, D.C. And in his statement to the Department of Justice, he said, "I see a lot of similar problems that I experienced in Philadelphia. I would appreciate if the Department of Justice came in and took a thorough, deeper look and gave us a pathway to do that." But more often than not, the biggest draw, the biggest kind of event that's going to draw media is going to be media coverage related to a particular set of events, right? So we'll say this. We'll say that there are a lot of means that come into it. That's not what I wanted. So I'm skipping all of a sudden. So there's significant media coverage of a particular event. That's actually how I got started with my own research program, was that I heard about the Seattle Police Department was being investigated by the Department of Justice. And one of the things that they stated was that the Seattle Police Department had a history of not de-escalating police-citizen encounters with people with mental health problems, right? This attracted the attention of the Department of Justice and instigated the Section 14141 process. And I remember speaking to one of my advisors, and he was like, "I don't know anything about it. You should write that paper." And I was like, "I should?" It's like, "Yeah." So, I mean, so that is typically the way the Department of Justice approaches this, right? Is that we look for significant media coverage. So if we look at, in the past year or so, the Department of Justice has decided to target the Louisville Police Department, Minneapolis Police Department, Phoenix Police Department, and then recently Louisiana State Police and the victim section of the New York City Police Department. These were all high-profile media events that attracted a lot of media coverage. It also attracted a lot of protests that were happening. And these were sort of seen, once the Biden administration came into power, these agencies were immediately investigated. I will note that when these events first happened, this did occur during 2020, but also recall that was during the Trump administration, which demonstrated a reluctance to institute police reform. So one of the first acts of Merrick Garland when he came into office was to investigate these police departments. As of today, these agencies are still under investigation. I'll explain why that's the case a little bit later on. But right now, there's no news about if the Department of Justice is going to instigate reform in any of these agencies. It's still a pending matter. So once the thing is, when the Department of Justice comes knocking on your door, right? And they are saying, "We want to investigate you. We suspect that there may be a pattern or practice of police misconduct in your agency," right? It doesn't really feel so good because it spells a lot of trouble for an agency, right? It spells a lot of expense that's coming in. Some agencies, when they hear from the Department of Justice, are very, they're uncooperative and they are resistant to make their officers available to speak with the Department of Justice. They're not willing to release official records so that the Department of Justice can review. And in some cases, in one case, I think it was East Haven, some of the police officers on staff actually threatened the Department of Justice staffers, saying that you better be careful because we can't guarantee your safety once you walk outside. And this is posted officially in one of the letters on the Department of Justice's website. Other agencies, though, and this seems to be the new trend, is that if the Department of Justice comes knocking on your door, they make every means to be very cooperative with the investigation, because in some cases, police organizers, police managers are in a position where they know there are existing problems and they aren't necessarily reluctant to it. They want to cooperate as much as possible with the Department of Justice to make officers available for interviews, to speak to command staff, give access to records, find missing information, right? So there's definitely, not everyone is like this, not every police agency is like this, but there is a lot of opportunity, and this kind of shades a little bit of what how the Department of Justice investigates and then recommends for reforms, as we'll see a little bit later. So when we think about if once eventually there's access to an agency, right, then extensive investigation takes place. On the Department of Justice special litigation website for conduct of law enforcement officers, there are a host of letters for ongoing cases and then also archived cases. And in the letter, in the investigation reports, the Department of Justice always outlines the cooperativeness of a police department. It also details the means that were used in order to document their findings. Oftentimes, right, they'll say that it took like 100 days of research on the ground. And when we discuss like these investigations, right, I mentioned earlier that there's a big focus on police departments. But there's also a huge emphasis on speaking with the community, right? Because one can't necessarily believe the records of a police department, right? You have to speak to the community to figure out what's happening on the inside. Another reason for that is that a lot of times the data that the Department of Justice was interested in finding out more about or collecting is simply not available, not for any kind of malicious kind of means, but simply because a police agency just did not have the record keeping system to keep track of it. So you have to rely on a qualitative aspect related to it. It sort of reminds me of the Intuitionist by Colson Whitehead, where there are quantitative numbers that you could go by, right? But one of the main characters in the book is a qualitative interpreter. And so we rely on her narrative to identify problems in the elevator business. So there's an extensive documentation. There's a lot of investigative interviews, and all these results are compiled at the end. In some cases, the Department of Justice, gives their blessing, says, we understand that maybe this high-profile media event was problematic, but we don't think that there is an actual problem from an organizational standpoint, right? We understand this is an isolated event, but there's otherwise good supervision, there's good training, there are good efforts to rectify any kinds of wrongs, the complaint system's intact. That's really good. Usually what the Department of Justice will do, though, is still provide a list of recommendations to make, right? So they'll say, hey, things seem okay. You might want to address some of these areas, right? So, but there's not a formal intervention. In other cases, though, and there are substantive problems that the police department can't possibly correct on their own, or they are believed to be unwilling, and they require a little additional encouragement to take those steps. So when we look at, some of the common problems that come up from these investigations, right? The first and foremost, most common one is issues related to use of force. And that can happen in a number of different ways. One is going to be, a lot of times the police departments will have policy books, right, about when you can use force under which conditions. And they'll also dictate a continuum of force, right? So at what point are you allowed to use like a verbal command, or to place your hands on someone, when to use a baton, or use a taser or something like that. And we think of it as a continuum. So they have outlines, and there's a policy suspected for that. Problematic agencies either have a failure in their policy, it's not up to date. It could also be not up to date with a constitutional standard, or it could be a problem in the sense that, like, if there is a use of force incident, there's no incident review. In some cases related to that as well, if there is an incident of use of force, right, and that force is investigated, the investigations are treated as shams, and they're not really in depth, and more often than not, there's no finding that an officer was wrong in their use of force. In some of the worst instances of that, there are investigators who tell DOJ investigators that oftentimes they're looking for ways to make the officer who used force look good so they don't lose their jobs. There's sort of an insulation effect where they're protecting one another. And when we talk about use of force review, that's not used all the time, right? But if, when the Department of Justice looks at incidents of force used over multiple years, and they find that only one out of perhaps hundreds of use of force instances was found to be in the wrongful, that suggests that there's a problem with the investigation process, right? So that's oftentimes what's related to that. In other cases, if we focus on the actions of a police department, there are cases like, say, with K-9 units, for example. One of the problems in Washington, D.C. was that when a K-9 unit was called to a scene for whatever reason, someone was getting bit as a result of a K-9 unit 70% of the time once they were deployed, which is an incredible amount, right? That suggests that there's not a lot of adjustment or restraint being used or taught to officers to maybe not sick your dog on someone if needed, right? It's seen as unnecessary. The other common issues, right, are related to discrimination. So sometimes this is like a failure to prosecute sexual assault cases. This was true in Missoula, Montana. In not investigating LGBTQIA hate crimes, that was true in New Orleans Police Department. And again, I note the language here that I'm using on the slide is that, the problem with the discrimination is the police department failing to take an action, which is a form of discrimination. It's not always police departments taking an action, right? They can fail to do something as well. The racial profiling, especially in one case, to give an example of like, how does this profiling manifest itself? There was a county in North Carolina, and the sheriff of the department instructed officers to set up checkpoints around places where it was known that Hispanic and Latino people lived. And so the goal of these checkpoints was to deliberately stop people and look for people who were undocumented, with the goal of deporting those people back to wherever they came from, and specifically targeted Hispanic Latino people. And lastly, the most kind of common problem oversight, right, is that there was no supervision of officers, right? There's a failure in the supervision practices. There's no accountability system. If there was a complaint system, they'd make it very difficult for someone to issue a complaint to someone. And what I mean by that, like an example of like a difficult way to form a complaint was that, say, the complaint office was only available at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, and you had to be there in person. There was no other way to set about it, right? That would be an example of how there's a poor accountability system in place. Or if there was a complaint that was filed, the time to investigate would take an incredibly long period of time, or the investigation itself would be lackluster, to say the least. So we find all these problems, though. The Department of Justice sets out they spend a ton of time to do it. And it's one thing to present someone with a set of problems, right? But it's kind of useless unless there's a means to ensure that people go out and correct the problem. And that's one of the important issues, right? Like, as much as someone can point out and say, these problems exist inside a police department, if there's no enforcement mechanism, if there's no means for someone to comply with the recommendations of the Department of Justice, then it's kind of toothless, right? No one really cares at that point, right? So what do we do in order to correct that? Or there's a few recommendations that are always made to police departments, right? In this, right? So they're asking police departments to revise policies to make them consistent with national standards and make sure they're constitutional, right? Which is fairly basic. But in other cases, sometimes the problems related to supervision and accountability is that there's a lack of training available to officers, right? Whether that could be due to a lack of funding from the city level, or maybe officers are not encouraged to pursue that kind of funding. And so if your officers were trained 20 years ago, they're not current with, training as it is in 2022, that's kind of a problem, right? Because you're used to an old standard. So one of the things that's consistently mentioned to police departments is to provide training to all the officers in place to make sure they're current with the modern policing standards. And of course, they also ask them to reform their internal oversight system so they can detect problem officers. And so but not only detect a problem officer, but also set out to reform the investigative aspect of it, right? Because if you find that officers are committing a series of behaviors that are consistent, they're alike in kind, then that suggests that there is a need to revise a policy or retrain officers. And so much like that here at CSUSB, they want to contribute to a culture of continuous improvement, and that is a key aspect of the use of force. The other aspect is they always encourage community policing. So to encourage police departments to move away from a warrior versus mindset where the community is the enemy and embrace more of a guardian aspect, and also to solicit opinions and feedback from the community and reframe its relationship with its police community. So how do we actually, what's the enforcement mechanism, right? Because we have all these recommendations for people to change. Again, it is pointless unless we do something about it. So they encourage police departments first, right? Because we always want to let them, think about their actions, right? To see if they actually, really don't want to participate. So the encouragement comes in a different kind of way. So one method is to threaten the police department with a civil lawsuit filed with the Department of Justice, right? And try to set some sort of financial relief to it, advertise that the police department doesn't want to comply with police reform. And that tends to be pretty effective, right? Because, no one necessarily wants to be sued. The other way that this can happen, and this has happened in a few counties or counties and cities, is that they will withhold federal money, right? So let's say one example of this, some police departments can apply to the Community-Oriented Policing Services Office and receive grant money to institute community-oriented policing within their community. And so if you choose not to participate or comply with the investigation, you choose not to do this, the federal government will make sure that your police department will not receive any grant money in the future, right? So, and that's especially critical if, say a police agency was relying on that money to hire new officers, to retrain them, or to fill in some budget shortfalls, right? So that's a powerful tool as well, right? Is we're going to prevent you from receiving additional funds. And the other encouragement part, right, is that it's one thing for the police department to have a list of recommendations. It's one thing to enter to an agreement to complete the investigation, but we need an outside set of eyes to make sure that you actually comply with it, right? It shouldn't be the government, because they're obviously motivated to ensure that you move towards constitutional policing. But the police department can't be trusted to follow it out because they're the offender in this case, right? So an independent monitor is used to correct that. So the monitor is maybe one of the most crucial players throughout this entire process. So the monitor is not going to be someone like me per se, right? But I may be part of a team that is intended to monitor a police reform effort. But there are groups that are across the country that focus themselves on as being, experienced in terms of just policing, procedural just policing, or they are good at making sure that police agencies are checking the boxes for the Department of Justice. And they are contracted to serve as an independent monitor. So what their role is to review all the recommendations, and this monitor is approved by the Department of Justice and by the police department. And the person who the entity that pays for this is the police department. The Department of Justice does not assume the cost of any of the investigations or helping a police department achieve whatever it is they need to achieve, whether it's in terms of training or instituting a supervision process. The Department of Justice may provide free labor, and they may be able to point a police department to financial resources in order to correct that. But they aren't paying for anyone to do this, right? So the police department assumes all the cost of the reform. So with the monitor in place, right, that person is paid by the police department, but they are independent, right? And they make reports that are submitted to the court overseeing the investigation and the agreement. So for the first few years, right, they will meet with the police department, they will investigate, they'll look at a whole range of files, and they will make a judgment on how far along a police department is to complying with the Department of Justice's requirements. So initially, at the beginning, they're filed on a quarterly basis because the process is very new, and then eventually it moves to a semi-annual basis, so about twice per year or so. Once a police department achieves substantial compliance, the monitor then continues to oversee for an additional 2 years. So you can't say that we hit substantial compliance and immediately stop. You have to demonstrate from an organizational standpoint a long-standing commitment to maintain those reforms, right? This is done in part to make sure that a police department doesn't just meet the letter of an agreement and then pull out their hands, right? It's meant to assess whether or not there's a true organizational change that occurs because of this reform. In most cases, the Department of Justice aims to be done in 5 years. But that often is not the case, right? So that's more of like a recommendation. And there are some reasons why that may be the case, and that is part of a project I'm working on with a co-author at San Diego State University. But for now, it is sufficient to say that as much as one tries to be done in 5 years, it's rarely the case. So big question, right? So we spend all this time, treasure, energy in order to, have police departments, facilitate and work towards reducing use of force, reducing discrimination, reducing illegal searches and seizures, reforming their relationship with the community. And there's, a lot of time, energy, and effort is spent to this. The police department is, investigated for years into going on. So, when you think about the expense that is put in time, money, and people to make this happen, when you consider, a history of pain and discomfort that a community has with it, it seems reasonable to ask, like, does this actually achieve what it intends to? So the answer to that is it depends, right? It depends on your look at it. So there's not a whole lot of research on in this particular area because there are, kind of not that many police departments have been targeted. What I mean by that is that there are over 18,000 police agencies in the United States, and they are not a monolith, right? It's a patchwork quilt of policing in it. As much as they may, like an officer may look like an officer from a neighboring community, so someone from a Colton police officer kind of looks like a Redlands PD officer, they're different agencies, right? And so it's when we target 50 or to 60 agencies, right? It's a very small fraction of the population, right? So we have to focus on, and given that the history of the Department of Justice has been going on for the last almost 30 years now, very few relative to the total number of police agencies have been targeted, right? So here's what we can say about as far as the limited number of agencies who have been targeted and have completed the process. We do know that initially their communities always have a better view of the police department after going through this process. There's limited evidence to support this, but a lot of community surveys indicate that the community notices a difference in its relationship with the police department that they're serviced by. So there is something to suggest, right, that the community feels better about a police department, and that there is a demonstrable change in the views of those people as a result of this process. If we look at instances of use of force or illegal or discrimination or complaint structures, we do see that there is a decrease in unconstitutional use of force. There is a decrease in discriminatory practices. And there is a reduction in complaints as well once a complaint system is reformed. If we look at some of my work that's related to that, one of the issues that we looked at was to look at civil rights litigation, because if there is a police department is targeted by a police department, or excuse me, by the Department of Justice or a citizen because of a police misconduct issue, someone can sue a police department under Section 1983 and to receive some form of relief. And the work that I've done suggests that many police departments see a notable decrease in civil rights litigation against them by engaging in this Department of Justice and process, right? So all this to say is that there is promising evidence that the Department of Justice, if they take the time, effort to encourage police departments to change, that they actually will. See, this is one of my goofy slides, right? At the same time, it's important to know that this is an imperfect system and something that is subject to a lot of controversy depending on who you're asked. There is no doubt that the Department of Justice, when they mandate an investigation and intervention into a police department, that it's very invasive, right? It doesn't necessarily feel good. And the police department, as a result, has a huge cost associated with completing all of these requirements issued by the Department of Justice. I remember speaking to someone from the Chicago Tribune a couple of years ago, and Chicago was under a consent decree. And at the time, this is in 2020, there was a lot of conversations about defunding the police, taking away funding from it and reallocating it to other sources of community support. And one of the questions from the reporter was like, how can we institute these reforms if money is being taken away from us if we defund the police? And that person is right. Retraining officers, redoing a policy, having a better complaint system, have a better monitoring of use of force incidents requires a lot of infrastructure that goes into place, right? And taking money away is not going to help an agency meet a substantial compliance rating related to that. So there's, and related to that cost too, is how many years it takes in order to be under supervision. If we go back to the monitor for a second, because those are required by the Department of Justice and they're signed on and they're paid for by the offending police department, a monitor service may cost $1 to $2 million per year. And for some agencies, the oversight has lasted about 7 years. So that translates just in the cost to a monitor to about a $14 million cost. That's independent of any other required reform related to retraining officers or creating new policies and stuff. So there's a substantial cost associated with that. There's also some questions, of course, about how committed are police departments to actually committing to organizational change, and how long does the effect of a Department of Justice intervention last after oversight ends. And so far, the evidence seems to suggest that there may be over a period of number of years, right? There may possibly be a lapse in the effectiveness of this oversight, that maybe in some cases, police departments regress back to their old ways. But I'd like to stress that evidence is uncertain at this point, because the Department of Justice does not have a means of following up with past agencies to see what kind of problems there may be. So we're really not sure on how true that is, right? The other part to consider too, right, is that the policing is always evolving. There's always new standards, right? And so some agencies instituted the reforms in 1997, and of course now it's 2022. So, what standard do we, hold them by, right? Do we hold them to the standard of what was true when oversight ended in 2002, or do we hold them to a modern standard 20 years later? So there's a lot of uncertainty about how exactly do we measure, long-standing compliance related to that. The other part to consider too is that, as I started this talk with, is that presidential administrations set the tone for the Department of Justice and their ability to seek out police reform. And so some of what is required in agreement or reform is dictated by a presidential administration. The Biden and Obama administrations have been much more active relative to, say, the Bush or the Trump administrations. They have a lot different view of things, right? So part of what looks at like what conditions our belief about the effectiveness also depends on like what agencies were required to do under whose presidential administration. And that's an area that is, part of what I'm studying with some of my colleagues down in San Diego State. So, I should have skipped over it. This was all the things that I was listing at. One that I did not comment on was, a lot of the recommendations that come into place when we think about reforming use of force policy or limiting illegal discrimination or instituting community policing. It's part of a generic list of requirements by a police department. It's not very tailored to a police agency, and these are all kind of the things that a police department is expected to do, but to the point where it's almost a little too generic, right? This isn't necessarily bad, right? Because maybe we do want to encourage community policing, right? And we do want to encourage that you revisit your use of force policy and increase your supervision. Those are all good things, right? We can kind of think this is sort of like a medicine issue where, we give an antibiotic out to someone and that treats a bacterial infection, and that's all well and good. We wouldn't ask you to change or do anything different like that. But there is some questions about how effective a generic prescription is. So, this is part when you can see the corruption happen in my slides. It's wonderful, right? Important thing to understand, though, is that we have this tool available to us, and it equips the Department of Justice with investigating suspicious agencies. It puts many agencies on a roadmap to improving their police department and ending patterns and practices of police misconduct. So because it requires an organizational transformation, right? It's a lot better than just focusing on taking care of things by individual civil rights laws, because it recognizes that a lot of police misconduct is at an organizational standpoint. And importantly, the Department of Justice emphasizes community feedback in this process, which you cannot do via litigation or through a complaint process, right? So it places the value of the community at the key. So with that said, when I was preparing for this, I have one more thing to share because I realized I managed to talk longer than I thought I was going to. One thing to keep in mind, right, is that the Department of Justice is very much revisiting its approach to it under the Biden administration. So as we can see here, they're now trying to incentivize police departments to voluntarily take on reforms related to use of force. And so rather than using the Maxwell silver hammer to encourage police reform, they're trying to take a more collaborative approach to encourage police departments to participate in this process, rather than having a threat of harm or an investigation taking place. The hope from the Biden administration is that police departments are going to be willing to engage and are willing to revisit their policies without the cost associated with monitor and without the extended oversight period. So at least for under this administration, it seems like police department is being taken seriously, and they're taking positive steps to improve that process in the long run. So with that, I guess I'm happy to answer any kind of outstanding questions that may have come through while I was talking.
Stan, until Stan reads the questions, I do have some observations, Zachary, and thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I was involved in a consent decree in the mid-1970s to hire women on the LA Sheriff's Department. And it worked out. Most police departments now are about 20% women, depending on the location. So that one worked out. But I did post one that was also involving the Sheriff's Department in the Antelope Valley, which is North County. And this was a recent consent decree, had a monitor, but people didn't show up. That is, the executives and the Sheriff's Department did not show up for what was supposed to be regular meetings. They did not give documents. it is a powerful thing to remember that in any community, the most powerful agency is the police department. Seriously, I mean, it's not the mayor, it's not the city council, it's not the board of supervisors, it's not the churches, it is the police department, because they are all over the place. And, you know, the person in Los Angeles, the sheriff of Los Angeles, is acting more like a king instead of, you know, a public servant. So I am somewhat skeptical of consent decrees. And I'm certainly skeptical of the Biden administration's, you know, putting them on their honor to change what they're doing. They're not going to give up the power. So there have to be, I think, you know, hitting them in the pocketbook. You know, when for example, someone gets sued, that money comes out of the city budget rather than coming out of the police department's budget. I think it could change overnight, and I think there's some talk in Sacramento of recommending those kinds of substantive changes, as opposed to, you know, putting people on their honor and you know, oh, we're going to change on our own. I just don't see that. And, you know, and maybe I am a cynic. I'm guilty. I'm guilty of that, but it comes out of experience, I think, and research, and you know, it's just, I think your talk, and no offense, but it's really depressed me. I'm sorry.
Depressing.
Because it you know, I just don't see our way out of this. I just don't. And when we lose sight of the fact that people are getting hurt every single day with these folks going in the community and thinking they're kings, you know, and having this ultimate power with guns and handcuffs and all of the accoutrements of you know, policing.
And looking at your boilerplate recommendation, Mary and I, we've talked about this in the past and in other meetings, and they don't work. You know, if you changed all those things in the boilerplate, the end result is you got bad apples still in the department. They're going to try another way of getting around those things. And then one of the things that the monitor does, he brings in their recommendations. And if it's more females you want on the job, it's easy to hire some females. Will they stay there? How long will they be there? How will they be treated? That's what happens after you got them on. I've got them on now. Then you know, African Americans, Latinos, when you get them on, what happens to them? And that's not being monitored, other than one time you did that they can come back after a few years and take a look at how things are going. But in general, a lot of them don't stay.
What do you think, Zachary?
So I guess we'll move to.
Let me put it another way. Are you hopeful or not?
I too am curious to see what happens, right? You know, I don't necessarily believe in hope per se, right? And I say that I remember speaking to a student journalist over the summer who asked me a similar question, right? Is there any chance for, you know, hope related to this, right? Because you know, what is it? I think that song's by Ace. How long has this been going on? And it's been going on for years, right?
Yeah.
And you know, and there's, you know, a long history of it, right? And I think part of the frustration is that, you know, any kind of positive stuff that's been happening is incremental in nature, right? You know, it does not happen all at once. You know, if we compare today's policing to policing 150 years ago, huge difference, right? It's incredibly different, but that was 150 years ago, right? And, you know, that's not within living memory of anyone that I know anyway. And so the changes that we still see, you know, abuses happen, and there's only so much that increasing documentation is going to do, to having body cameras put into place. At the same time, and we think about the way that American police is situated, there's over 18,000 police departments, right? It's very easy. 50 or 60 of them is a very small percentage of that. Having said that, when we think about the agencies that have participated, a lot of them tend to be larger police agencies. And it suggests, I think the last number I saw was that 20% of the American population that was covered in those targeted agencies, right? So they are looking at agencies who are policed, who service most, or a good sizable chunk of people in the United States. But yeah, it is a frustrating process, and especially if you want reform now. I understand your criticism of the Biden administration, what their effort is. I think that's well placed, but it is. I will say that relative to other presidential administrations, the Biden administration is looking for ways to encourage more reforms related to use of force. One aspect of this was in the Columbus Police Department, where they were exploring ways to receive funding, because one of the big reasons that police departments take a long time to comply is that they don't have the money to service their main budget. And so the Department of Justice is willing to explore options to encourage that if police departments demonstrate they're willing to take positive steps to do that. In some work that I've done, we asked me and my co-author, we asked some folks about if they were willing to pay for police reform, whether like that is a good use of tax dollars. And it seems like most people are willing to pay from a budgetary standpoint. So that may be something to explore as well. But to Stan's point about the bad apples still hanging out in the rotten orchards, that's something that the Department of Justice is certainly cognizant of, right? And there's always going to be people who don't do good things in any kind of organization. One of the things that the Department of Justice encourages is to improve hiring practices to hire and retain good people. A lot of times that it's about reframing its mission statement, having better pay and benefits, and finding ways to increase internal oversight to limit the influence of any kind of bad apple, and also really focus on trying to change the culture of an institution, right? Because if the culture is seemingly bad, people are going to leave, right? And they don't want to stay. They don't want to be associated with a police department that has a poor reputation, because then you internalize that as well. So I mean, your points are correct, and that is part of like the beautiful mess of modern policing, right? Is that there are so many interrelated fragments in this patchwork quilt of misconduct that there's so many areas to address. But consent decrees, while they are limited in how many agencies they've targeted, they are the best of what's around at this point. And it's nice to see that the Biden administration is looking to rethink its approach in the United States.
I would also argue that sorry, Stan, but that the budget is, it's a straw dog. You don't need extra money to switch your training from so much firearms training in the academy. We showed a chart last week of how the vast majority of police training is focusing on firearms as well as self-defense, and nothing, very, very little on conflict resolution, for example.
Sure.
You don't have to have a lot of money for that, but I think it's symbolic in that it's showing the individual officers that this is what we want you to focus on. This is how you're going to resolve issues, by taking out your gun, taking out your baton, and solving it that way. Where I don't understand the whole budget argument, I guess.
Well, if there is a new training like conflict resolution or de-escalation, and that's not part of the established training standards for state police, right? and if there is a conflict resolution, or if there is something on interacting with diverse groups in policing, right? And you want officers to participate in that, but they also have to maintain compliance with existing constitutional standards related to any kind of use of force, right? As much as we disagree with use of force policy, we don't want them trained, right? There's still a responsibility to learn how to use it, to understand the legal standard, to retrain that policy. Any kind of new training requires officers to travel to wherever the training is being held, to experience it. And you're also removing officers from their day-to-day jobs as well related to that. And if you are hiring a consultant to help you rewrite your policy, especially if it's external, you have to pay the consulting fee as well, related to that. And if we think about like internal investigation structures or complaint structures, and you're having to hire a consultant or to and build up the infrastructure to do that, or if you were asked to create a body-worn camera system, right? There's an ongoing cost related to storing body camera footage as well. And so, your point's well taken, but I mean, there are budget costs because the police department, defending police department, has to maintain its ongoing, mission, right? They have to pay for the fuel in cars, uniforms. They have to pay for, professional development that already exists. But then there's this new cost that's attached to it as well that creates a budget crunch.
I'll let Stan ask the questions, but it doesn't cost any. It doesn't cost anything to change the zeitgeist. It does not change. It doesn't change. It doesn't cost anything for the sheriff of Los Angeles County or the Los Angeles police chief to say, we are not going to tolerate this anymore. It has to come from them. That doesn't cost any money. But your point also is well taken. I see now that you've broken down, what costs may be incurred. But I think it still comes from a willingness or unwillingness to.
Absolutely, there's absolutely the organizations have to demand it and enforce it. It can't just be a show. Right. Like, this is what we're doing, right? You have to demonstrate you're willing to enforce it as well.
Right. And two statements.
Have questions, Stan?
Yeah, two statements down the same line. And one says, I'm pretty sure I read an article not long ago that the Biden administration is actually increasing the police budget. Would that help to bring reform to the police? And let me go read the second one too, because it's real close to that. It's a different person. It says, how can anyone believe that the police need even more funding? Don't they have enough, especially in most cities? Maybe they need to give up their expensive military equipment for their training.
In terms of funding, right? I'm not necessarily, advocating that we need to make increased police funding to make people feel safer. But I mean, budgets always are going to increase because of inflation. So there's always going to be an increase related to that. And there's also, maintenance cost of vehicles and stuff like that, especially if they're, a police department decides to hire more officers and make sure they're better trained, because that affects their service community. And there are, continued costs associated with that in terms of pay, in terms of benefits, in terms of salaries, along with the equipment attached to that. So there are costs related to that. When we say, but this isn't necessarily advocating that we need to dump more money into police to do traditional police thing. This is the funding that I'm talking about is about encouraging that there is a reform process that gets in place and that is properly funded. Otherwise, because that can contribute to a delay in the police reform process. If there is a delay in the reform process, that means that there is a longer event horizon of police misconduct, a lot of harm, a lot more exposure to discrimination, complaints that are not being founded, continued community tensions with that, because it is taken longer to institute a reform. So I wouldn't say that I'm advocating that we need to increase police budgets just for the sake of it, right? But if you want to encourage police departments to reform and you're actively trying to reshape policing in America, a lot of it does cost money, and there has to be an avenue for you to encourage people to do that. I would say that if you have funding and you're making it available, what you're choosing to fund says a lot about your values. And the Biden administration is looking to fund to ensure that there is reform in terms of use of force and limiting discrimination and other forms of police misconduct. So, I understand that it's, very easy and appropriate to react to any kind of inclination that we should increase police budgets for the sake of police budgets. But the funding is related to a cause that has been expressed by the Biden administration.
Thank you. It is another one. It says, if you increase the consequences of police officers that are found guilty of a crime, would that bring on reform?
I guess it depends. Like, if you're talking about if someone's found guilty, of a crime and they're convicted and they end up going to prison, that officer's in prison. So if they're found guilty of it, then that officer is removed. So those consequences are there. I guess I'd have to know more about what if it's beyond guilt or if you were talking more about like a civil litigation aspect. If we explore the civil litigation aspect a little bit, more often than not, someone who brings a suit against the police department is going to do it against the police department to seek financial relief. And the police officer, relatively speaking, doesn't have the cash, right? They're not an incentive target, relative to a city budget, right? Especially since, an insurance company, is likely to pay that out. If we did make police officers more financially responsible in some way, I guess it would, it suggests that we're targeting a police department a police officer, and we do want them to, feel the teeth of it, right? But the prosecutorial culture is sent on seeking financial relief right now. And that's going to come, the most financial relief is going to come from the police department or the city itself. So, I guess there would have to be some relaxation in a discussion about how we prosecute civil rights abuses committed by police officers while they're conducting their duties, and what would be better related to that. In the current environment, many police officers, if they are the target of a civil rights litigation, almost never hear about the case, right? It gets up, it's handled by the police department attorneys and the city attorneys, and they don't face the financial consequences. I forget the author's name, but there was it's a lawyer, I believe she's at Stanford, and she surveyed a bunch of police departments to figure out what officers are aware of civil rights litigation brought against them and what are the consequences of that, and many of them don't know. And so maybe part of that is that we need to make sure that an offending police officer is involved with that process and understands the extent of harm that happened as a result of their actions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. Anyway, and I think he was saying that he felt that if they were found guilty of murder, they should do life in prison as opposed to getting a short term. And that's what he was, I think, leading to. And then this one is about the Texas shootings. And he said about how the police reacted to Texas shootings. Should police get disciplined or fired for failing to protect citizens?
For failing to protect citizens? I guess, it depends, right? Because police officers are not Secret Service people, so they're not trained, nor are they really expected to jump out in front of bullets for people, right? A Secret Service member is expected to do that, and that's part of their duties. But if we, think back to Uvalde, which speaks to me as a Texan, we saw a lot of those on cameras like that, where a small town police officer, that there's a video of someone using hand sanitizer, getting a drink of water, bottle of water, and not investigating. And if that was spread on social media, that was spread across the news media, and it leads to a lot of questions about, we invest a lot in police body armor and weapons and training in order to handle these situations. And yet, when push comes to shove, they seem unable or unwilling to intervene in that case. As far as, do we hold those police departments, police officers criminally accountable? I'm not sure as far as what that could be, right? Because that takes, that gets into a lot of like decision making from an officer standpoint. At a minimum, it raises a lot of questions about the state of policing and why we invest so much in armor and guns and stuff like that. And they're not willing to intervene. But the only thing I know for certain is that I don't know enough about that particular issue. But I think that's an important part of the ongoing conversation about police reform.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this already, but do you think allowing the people to vote on how funds are directed to police would be a good idea?
If their funds are directed, I guess in some ways we do that by electing representatives to Congress in our city anyway. When we talk to a representative and we vote for them, right? They're representing us in the democratic process, right? And they're making decisions for us, because if we open it up to everyone to decide all the time, there's a lot of issues related to that. So I guess, if there was anyone, if there were questions about how police departments and police budgets are funded, I think that needs to play out in the political process. And I don't think in terms of local political process, there's pretty low turnout, generally speaking. And if you would like a candidate to make that a key component of their platform, you should seek them out or encourage existing candidates to make citizen voice much more part of that process.
Thank you. I was just, through your talk, I was just looking at my notes, and one of my notes says, from the whistleblower to the cell phone. It's changed the monitoring of police departments. In other words, it used to be the whistleblower had to come, someone had to come up forward and say, hey, this is what's going on. And now all of a sudden it's the cell phones telling you what's going on and showing you what's going on. Quite a transition.
And it sure did change the way, we can only imagine what would have happened to the Rodney King case had there not been a video. This was the precursor of the cell phone, but that video just, I think, opened people's eyes to the extent to which police will go to exact revenge or punishment or whatever, their own judge and jury. So yeah, I agree.
It is a good one. Says, can a consent decree include relocating funds to things like mental health response teams?
So the answer is I don't know for sure, and here's my guess as to why that's the case. A police department, the Department of Justice, when they investigate and intervene, their powers are limited to the police department itself. They are not targeting the city, and they're not discussing the city budget as it relates to it. So a lot of their focus is related to what is within the scope of a police department's power to do. Now, a police department can certainly advocate for its budget, and they can certainly, I'm sure they would probably talk to city managers and city council about how they should allocate funds, what they should focus on. But the consent decree process could encourage and does encourage a lot of de-escalation techniques, especially with respect to mental health related issues. And that's been a more modern fixture in a lot of these agreements. And so they actively encourage police departments and require them to explore conflict resolution, to explore mental health de-escalation techniques, to explore alternative means. So that is a component of it. But in terms of reallocating their budget to fund other parts of social services in society, I don't believe the Department of Justice can require a police department to do that.
Thank you. I remember in my time in the fire department, they brought in a diversity team. And I know you're talking about the cost of all these different programs that they bring in, that they have to finance it. And so this team came in and spent, I'd say 2 months training individuals to be diversity trainers. And so, but the cost had to be tremendous. And you're right, when you talk about making some kind of changes and you start looking at the costs, a lot of departments especially the one of my size, you know, they had the money, but a lot of departments don't have that kind of money. So I do understand that part of your conversation.
And that part's also compounded to, you know, for small police departments, right? Because when we think of police misconduct, right, we always hear about larger cities like Albuquerque, Chicago, Minneapolis, Philadelphia. But the Department of Justice has also demonstrated they're willing to investigate smaller police departments in more rural parts of America, which are often not talked about in conversations about police reform. So places like Villa Rica, Georgia, or Beacon, New York, right? And you know, that is a careful balancing act because, you know, while a larger police department may be more likely to gather the funds to do that, a smaller one's not going to be as likely to do that. And that is an important part of the process.
I hate to pour cold water on us, but we're going to have to let our guest go. Zachary, thank you so much. I should say, Dr. Powell, please forgive me for calling you Zachary, but I'm just so grateful that you have enlightened our campus as well as the community on what is actually happening behind the scenes when it comes to police reform. I think that it can be multi-pronged, as you have shown, and I just hope, against all hope, that it comes to pass in my lifetime. I don't know if that's going to happen, but we'll see. We'll see. Thank you again so much. We appreciate you.
Of course. Thanks for having me. And, you know, I was born Zachary and I'm still Zachary. It's like, no.
Okay. Okay, Zachary. Well, thank you.
For joining us.
We appreciate you.
Take care.
We'll see you.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.